anyone who is in ministry, I think, needs to constantly be understanding the other who might present himself or herself in ministry. So whether it's walking into a hospital room and meeting someone who is dying or seriously ill or about to have surgery, what's going on inside that person? So I think the Franciscan approach is to start with, a listening, a sense of being present to the other. Saint Francis experienced God at what I think was a low point in his life, and perhaps one of the great low points for many people, and that is having experienced a very deep tragedy. For Saint Francis, the tragedy was being a prisoner of war and having experienced war and violence himself, and probably having killed people in battle. The mental as well as the physical toll that it took on Francis must have been akin to what we learn now is post-traumatic stress disorder in our soldiers who experience war even today. And I think that God met Francis somewhere in the depths of all of that, and that Francis was so overwhelmed by knowing that God loved and accepted him, even when he had done terrible things. He just experienced being loved and accepted. And out of that personal experience of God loving him came the realization that that's how God was toward every creature, every person certainly, but every creature, every part of the created universe. And from that comes our basic Franciscan idea of a universal fraternity. It's a word perhaps that is used for men, but to broaden that word out, a universal community, a sense of being valued and loved, and that every part of God's creation has that same value and worth and dignity and deserves respect. So from that, I think, is where the Franciscan heart tries to begin and tries to accept the other. Francis himself tells us that this happened because in his testament he writes, "When I was still in sin, I despised lepers." I'm paraphrasing here, but that lepers were one group of people. People with leprosy were outcast. They were shunned by the greater society. And Francis had a horror of even meeting them on the road. And he says that God led him into their midst, and he embraced them. What was previously distasteful to him became sweet. And that's probably Francis' word for that experience of totally being changed. And this was conversion for Francis, and it was a conversion toward a universal acceptance of everybody. In the 800th year of remembering the encounter of Francis and the Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil in Egypt during the Crusades, we experience also that kind of acceptance. That was what Francis would have walked into the camp of the Sultan in between this the no man's land where two armies, European Crusader forces, Muslim forces, were kind of locked in a siege. Francis went across the lines and encountered the Sultan. And we don't know all of his intentions, why he did this, but I believe that certainly underlying his motivation would have been to accept and love this other, if you will, a man whose faith made him demonized in the eyes of Christians of that time. Francis accepted him as a brother. Before Francis went to the Muslims in 1219, a group of friars had gone to Morocco and had a very confrontational approach and wanted to preach Jesus to the Muslims and to do it in a way that was quite confrontational and trying to get them to convert. And that episode resulted in their martyrdom. The local leaders where they were in Morocco asked them to cease and desist. Don't press this. You're stepping over some kind of a line here. And they kept doing it, and they were eventually martyred. Francis heard about this, and in his attempts to write a rule for his brothers, after he came back from this encounter with the Sultan, I think he had this rather disastrous encounter in mind, and he wrote an instruction that said, when you go into situations like this, and I think he was thinking of encountering Islam, that the first thing you should do is just to be there, be at peace, submit to one another, submit to those people. And only if the Lord gives you the inspiration should you take the next step and preach Jesus, if it seems right. And that instruction was a very different approach than these first Franciscan martyrs had had. And I think it was influenced by Francis' own experience. And the story of Francis with the Sultan took on many other interpretations, for Franciscans at least, over the centuries. It was reinterpreted, if you will, to make Francis look more heroic, look like he was going there to convert the Sultan, perhaps. The needs of the order and the church seemed to require this sort of enhancement of that story to make Francis look like a real heroic saint. Could have been one of the reasons. So the encounter hasn't really been rediscovered until our time. Here in the 21st century, we're beginning to re-examine and see this encounter of two men of different religions in the light of a different approach, and perhaps maybe truer to what Francis' original intentions were, to simply go to this brother, to be himself, to present Jesus, but to do it in a way that was respectful of the other. And certainly that interpretation that scholars are now discussing, in the Franciscan circles anyway, and some Muslim circles as well, becomes a model for today's encounter between people whom society might view as enemies, whether it's religious or political or cultural or whatever, that this is an approach where the other is respected and understood as a brother or sister, despite the differences that we might have or might be imposed on us from outside.